Social Capital, Collective Efficacy, and her journal articles appear regularly in the Journal of Staff Development. She got her Ph.D. in 1998, and she recently contributed Chapter 4 in the Innovations in Leadership Coaching, Research and Practice. And I am delighted to have her be here presenting on her research and her focus areas. And so without further ado, Diane, I would love to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. It's for your nice words. And I can't say how thrilled I am to be here with the Fielding Institute today. It's hard for me to believe that it's been over 20 years since I graduated with my doctorate. It seems to have gone by in a fly. About a year ago, you guys sent out a call for proposals, and I took one look at it and thought, I want to be in this book that the Fielding Institute was publishing. I'm just going to put it up so people can see it. Most of you know about it if you're with Fielding, and it will be referenced in the bibliography sent to everybody at the end of this. And I was lucky and had my article accepted, and it was called Coaching for Efficacy, a focus on the development of an internal locus of control. And so that's the focus of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be going more deeply into the work that co-author is on. Bill Sommers is on this call today. If you can see Bill waves, so if people can see you, they know you're there. And anyway, I'm going to be spending time talking a little bit in more detail about two theoretical constructs that I learned about actually before I came to Fielding, but I actually worked with them quite a bit for a long time when I was at Fielding. They were part of my dissertation work. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide. And whoops, I'm in the wrong place. And what I want to do is I want to start by talking about what became my epistemological foundation. I came to Fielding to become a researcher and to learn more. I already had 10 years of experience as a coach, and I wanted to learn more about what the theory was behind what I was doing. I knew that I was a very successful coach and I was quite efficacious in what I did, but I really didn't have the theory. I'd learned a way of coaching, and I had learned how to make it evidence-based with the work I had done with my colleagues, but I didn't have all the theory that I really felt like I wanted. And so that was my mission at Fielding. I also wanted to become a writer. I knew that my direction in life was going to take me to writing, and I felt that disciplining myself in a doctoral program would help. And I'm happy to say I got both of those from Fielding, and I've continued to be a practice-based theoretician. So I'm proud of that. And so my epistemological foundation that I really formed while I was at Fielding, came to really understand it deeply, even though I had already dabbled in it, really focused on two elements from the research that I felt were very important. And these elements I don't feel are as widely used or understood in the coaching community as I think they should be. So that was part of my motivation for writing the article. And those two constructs are locus of control and efficacy. And I'm just going to briefly define them, and then we'll go into more detail throughout this class tonight. And I say welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here. The definition of a locus of control is the degree in which a person believes they have control over the outcomes in their lives. So people that have a high degree of locus of control feel that they control what's happening in their life. They do not feel like they're victims, and they often are able to move forward in successful ways because of that belief. If I'm a coach and I believe that I have a high locus of control, then that means that I am willing to give the control to the client. And this is something that I've watched novel coaches struggle with, because they get an idea in their head about what they want the client to do, and they take away the control. And what that means is they start telling the coachee, I'm going to use that term tonight to talk about the person being coached, and they start to tell that coach what to do. And when that happens, that the locus of control shifts away from the person being coached, and the coach now owns that locus of control. I want to just look for a minute if there's anything else. I wanted to just give an example of how I look for locus of control. I might notice that there's negative language. Just a minute, I lost my train of thought. Let me go into efficacy and then come back to that. In efficacy, it's very similar to locus of control, but it's different. Locus of control is a calibrated aspect. You'll see that more as we go on. Efficacy is more of an outcome or a destination. but it's the self-belief in your capacity to successfully perform. And that was first talked about by Bandura. He actually started talking about this in the 80s, but the reference that I've most often used and will be in the bibliography is the 1993 one. And efficacy means that it's a highly conscious skill, because it means that I know that what interventions I do that produce success. Let me give you an example of two different people. One person might say, I know I'm just a great coach because everybody tells me I'm a great coach. That person doesn't really necessarily have a high degree of efficacy. Somebody who has a high degree of efficacy can tell you what they do. For example, one of the things that I teach when I teach coaching is about building trust and rapport. And we teach ways to calibrate that and to watch for it. And I'm very efficacious when it comes to building trust with my clients. And I pay attention to what the other person is doing, and I adjust for that. And I can tell you the kinds of things that I pay attention to. So I don't say I'm just a great coach. I can tell you precisely how I am a great coach. So I have a capacity to believe I can influence others, and I can validate my efficacy by talking about observation and feedback. So what you have are these two constructs that seem simple, but they're actually quite complex. And we'll be spending the rest of our time looking at these in more depth. I want to take a minute and look a little bit more. And by the way, the diagrams that you see here in this presentation will also be part of what Carrie will email to everybody at the end of the presentation. So you will have these to look at if you want to refer to them. They're also in the chapter that I wrote for the book for fielding. This looks just at the tension in locus of control between a coach and a client. And what you see is a balance. And when a coach puts too much control into the coaching relationship, they actually take the power away from the client. And the client then begins to look at the coach as their expert, and they become dependent on the client. You know more, you just tell me what to do. The coach starts to direct more. Their language turns to more of information, and the focus is more on external variables. And it usually produces low client efficacy. I'm not sure you always know the right answer. Just do it, Diane, is something that somebody with low efficacy might say to me in a coaching relationship. If I work to create reciprocal control, because as a coach, I can't ever really let control go. I am the one who's kind of dictating the direction of the conversation just by the relationship. But if my intention is to let the other person do as much talking as possible, to do as much thinking as possible, I am really working from facilitation skills, not from directing. I'm mediating. I care about how the person thinks, and I ask them about how they're thinking. I focus on those internal thoughts, and I use the linguistics of mediation, which is paraphrasing, inquiry, silence. And when a client makes up their mind, they actually have high client efficacy. You can see it in the coaching. They start to talk about it as if it's their problem. It's not a problem that's out there. Somebody has a problem, it's often out there. And when they get to this point where they have self-efficacy, they start to talk about it as if it's my problem and I know how to solve it. I used to laugh when I first started coaching because I asked for feedback from my coachees. And I would say, how did this go? How did it help you? And they say, oh, you have such good ideas. And I'd say, did I give you any ideas today? Because I wasn't giving ideas. And they'd say, no, not really, but this coaching really works. So, and then I could ask them more about what worked and get some better data. But what I found is when there's high client efficacy, they feel that they are prepared to go out and do what it is they need to do. They follow through. So I think follow through is an important variable that we're always working for. And you often hear people talk when they're talking about their coaching relationships about follow through being either a problem or something they're good at. And then before we go any further, I just want to stress that if there's anything that I'm talking about tonight, I'm talking about efficacy and locus of control, but I'm also talking about the whole act of reflection, and we'll be talking more about that. But you can never forget that what our business is to put ourselves out of a job as coaches. We want to teach people how they can think about their own problems and be able to self-reflect. And of course, if you study Keegan's work at all, you know that the ability to self-author is one of those important milestones in human development. So Bill, who's on the call with us today, and I decided that we wanted to we were actually had done some workshops, and we were debriefing after the workshop, and we started talking about how we worked with locus of control. I was working as a superintendent of schools at the time, and he was working as a high school principal. And we were deep into working with making changes in our schools and also in facilitating groups and coaching. And we began to talk about how we didn't stay in one place with the locus of control, particularly in our jobs as leaders. It required us to shift. Sometimes we had to be a lot more directive than we really ever thought we wanted to be. When we were just coaching teachers as a mentor, we didn't have to be as directive. We could stay more in the reflective zone, which you see represented on the left side. But as an administrator, we had to step in and intervene sometimes, and we were playing with that tension. How do we know when to do that, and what does that mean? And on the back of a napkin, Bill just basically started to sketch out. We came up with a dashboard, and we started to talk about which actual coaching interventions did we think were the most important for us. And we basically identified 9 of them. And we realized that those kinds of conversations were conversations we were having, and that they were making a big difference in our schools. And so we outlined them and then filled in the rest of the diagram. I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about this diagram in sections, but I just want to give you the big overview right now. And so when we put in our proposal to CORE, when they accepted it, and they, if you write a book for CORE, when they send your work out to other people so that they can give feedback to the authors, it's actually very helpful because you always get something that helps you make it a better book. And one of the things that confused some of our readers was that they didn't either know very much about some of these particular ways of doing things like SCAR for conflict to consensus or positive deviance. And some people were really confused because the things that live on the right side aren't even coaching models. We were using them in our coaching work, but they weren't written or designed to be used for coaching in particular. And some people thought some of our work was dated. They wanted it to be the most recent, fresh thing that had come out. And what we were doing is we were giving our wise opinion. But really, all these things around the outside are really just exemplars. They are not really the meat of what we were talking about. What really is the meat is the intention that a coach has. And those are what these little diagrams in the middle where it says reflective conversations, framed reflections, calibrating. Those are intentions of the coach. And that's what we found was really the valuable thing about playing with this. Also, I want to just mention, because I didn't take it out of the graphic and I'm not going to spend any time on it tonight, but the book in chapter 3 goes into great detail about the work of Bob Kagan and how stressors in our environment push us back into the lower levels of human development. And that if we really want people to be efficacious, we need to work to help them be authoring, self-authoring and self-transforming. And so this diagram at the bottom shows that that's a foundational piece of our work as well. And so anyway, so this is basically the diagram that was in the book. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift our focus and look at what are we talking about when we say this is really an intervention model, and that all those conversations on the outside are only exemplars. And what I really want you to do is I want you to think about where you work as a coach, and I want you to try to figure out where you live on this diagram as I talk you around the arch. Because we all live in some parts of it. And sometimes you're going to find you move around a lot because really effective coaches, and if you've got a lot of experience, you learn how to back up and go forward and change what you're doing, because if it's not working, do anything but what you're doing right now. Once again, just to notice, I didn't mention before, but down in the left-hand corner, you have a little green can and will. And what this means is that you're in a relationship that has high trust, and that the people that are working together can and will work together to make changes. And you see the color is green for go. And when you move around to the other side of the diagram, you see that we have can't and won't. And it's not often talked about in coaching, but sometimes there's a need to exit a coaching relationship. Certainly as a leader, there's times to exit people from your organization. So we kind of played with that tension a little bit. But what tells you that it's time to make those decisions is when they either can't, for some reason, can't make a change, or for some reason won't. And I'll talk a little more about that later. So when you think about what your intentions are as a coach, are you one that likes to stay a little more open and really let your client set the direction and you really just like to have more of a reflective conversation. In the old days, we called it the Rogerian method because we didn't really direct their thinking. We just asked them, what is going on for you? Or are you somebody that is really much more goal focused in your coaching? If you ask a lot of questions about goals, you're actually framing the conversation and suggesting to the person that they really do need to have goals in their, in what they're thinking about. And so what you see is on the reflective side is very open-ended and then a little narrower approach, but still open-ended. You're not telling the people what their goals are or what they need to be thinking about. You're just asking them to think about goals. When we get to the top, we move to and I put it up here because this is where 360-degree feedback lives. It's where feedback comes into the system from external sources. When you live on the left side of the diagram, you are not bringing external sources into the coaching conversation other than as an invitation for thinking. You're not telling or directing. When you get to stakeholder-centered coaching, and we'll talk about it in more detail, you're all of a sudden bringing in detail or data from people that are working with somebody. So the stakeholder is now giving data for the coaching. And I don't think Marshall Goldsmith uses this term calibrating conversations, but in our community, we did use calibrating conversations because what you're trying to figure out is how open is that person to the data that they are receiving. And if they're open to the data, then you can move to the left and begin to coach them in the ways that are described on the left. If they're not open to the data, sometimes you kind of have to hit them over the head and maybe move in the other direction. On the right side, you see framed directions, and this is where you are more prescriptive. You might decide that they need to learn a certain skill, and you're going to frame the directions and then coach them around a certain skill. And by the way, none of these are right or wrong. They're just a way of looking at locus of control and paying attention to how you're holding control as a coach. And then the last one is a prescriptive conversation. And we're going to show you at the end of this, or I'll show you at the end of this, that a prescriptive conversation can also be mediative, but I'm directing the thinking and then giving the gift of my thinking back to the other person and expecting them to do with it. So what we're working for is from open sure to more of a closure approach to things. Are there any questions in the chat room, or should we keep moving?
None yet. Great information.
Okay. If anybody has questions or confusions, write them in the chat room. And if we have time, we'll stop going through. And if I find we're running a little behind, we'll put them at the end. That way we're respectful of everybody's time. Okay, moving right along. So now what I want to do is I really want to talk in detail about what are these different kinds of conversations. If you think you live on the reflective side, and I've taken the theorist away for the most part, other than I've left in two of the grandees of organizational development because I feel like they need to be honored in the fielding tradition. But the first conversation that we talked about was something called the reflective conversation. Bill had actually written a whole book with a friend about it. And reflective conversations were first talked about in organizational development and business development by Donald Schoen back in the 50s and 60s. And he found that professionals did an internal conversation with themselves that could also be talked about in public with other people, and that they actually thought a lot about what they were doing in action. So he talked about reflection on your behaviors as a leader or as a teacher or whatever you were doing, a business person. What are you doing in action? And then he found that really reflective people actually moved to think about it afterwards. Most of us have gone away from something we've been doing and we find ourselves in the shower still thinking about something that happened during the day and how we would make changes. And then Schoen never really got into the third layer of this. But once we've decided that we don't like what we did or we want to make changes, we begin to plan for the future. So it's really a circle. We reflect on something in action, we think about it afterwards, and then we make plans for the future. The real point here is that you are asking as the coach, you're asking the person what they want to think about, and you're co-pondering with them about their professional practices, but you're not nudging them in any particular direction. You're really giving the coachee a lot of freedom to go wherever they want. And all of us start coaching in a more open-ended way because it's important to see what's going on in somebody's head. So it's not like it's an either or place. And some people tend to live in this zone a little bit more than others. Moving up, I give tribute to Edgar Schein, and Bill and I, when we first did this book, really debated whether goal focus should come next or open-ended. And when we really looked at it, we realized that Edgar Schein actually brought a great gift to our thinking. One of the reasons why I write is I like the ahas, and our aha was that he actually is asking very open-ended questions and really not telling anything. And Edgar Schein is an interesting gentleman. We've had the pleasure of working directly with him twice now. And he's in his 80s, is retired and lives in a rest home in Stanford, but still very much alive and vital. And he was a consultant where he was going out and telling people what they needed to do. And he found that he was getting a lot of resistance or that people weren't following through. And he began to play with ways that he could move the conversation in a different direction. And he realized that if he moved to something that he wrote a book called Humble Inquiry. If you're interested in this, we highly recommend the book. Our chapter tells you about it, but nothing in detail like his writing. And what he found is that people had the internal resources. There's a belief when you live in this green zone that people have their own internal resources. And what your job as a coach is to bring out those internal resources. And I want to read briefly the questions that he started asking. So you can see how open-ended they are. He found that when he asked his constituents, rather than telling them, he asked them, what's going on here? What would be an appropriate thing to do for that? What's going on here? What would be an appropriate thing to do for that? That they very quickly solve their own problems. And when they solve their own problems, the solution was more elegant than anything they would produce by being told. And then once they started coming to some solutions, he actually asked him a locus of control question. Who are you dependent on to get that done? Is that something you can do alone and you can go and do it right now? Or do you need to make some plans to work with another person? And then the last one is, who am I dependent on in order to get this to happen? So it's what are you going to do to change that relationship with that person? He called this process humble inquiry. And what he says, and this is why he's so wise, is that I thought I had the answers. And what I found was I had none of the answers, and that the people that I work with had all the answers. And I just get goosebumps whenever I think about that, because that's a fundamental belief. I do believe that most of the people we work with have a lot more skill than we give them credit for. Then we move up. So those are the reflective conversations, and there's plenty of different ways you can frame this. This is just how Bill and I framed it. The next one is goal-focused conversations, and this is where I divulge what my bias is. My training originally, actually, I helped develop the model, was in cognitive coaching. I had the good fortune to get my administrative credential here in California with Art Costa and Bob Garmston, who have been mentors to me. And they started something that's well-known. Jenny Edwards, you're on the call tonight. You've been involved in it, and as actually a trainer for it. And it's a very focused coaching. You are always asking, what do you have? We used it with teachers. What are you planning? What goals do you have? What outcomes do you have? But what's missed in that is that a lot of times, and I see this in the novice coaches, is they think they need to get real clarity with the goal. And I'd like to suggest, especially for those of you that are in the evidence-based coaching program, that the real questions are about how do you measure your success, the efficacy question. And that if people don't have well-formed goals, they actually have to go back and reframe their goals, because they can't measure their success or tell you what evidence they're going to collect about their own behavior unless their goal is clear. So what I've found is that goal-focused coaching is really powerful, but what's most powerful is asking how they measure the success. And so this one in particular is one that I was well-versed in and used a lot. So I find, and even when I've called myself a cognitive coach, that I was often moving from coaching back to the more open-ended, and then sometimes I was moving the other direction and moving up towards something that was a little different. The next one was one that we struggled with, and Bill and I changed the one we chose here several times. Finally landed on using the SCARF model, which is a human motivation model used by David Rock. But I'm going to, for the purposes of our example today, I'm calling it consciousness building. And what this means is the coach brings a set of knowledge to the coaching relationship and invites the person to join them in the coaching relationship, but they're not directing them to do anything. And the best example, and I really think it's a fun example since we're really looking at alternate consciousnesses with Black Lives Matter, is Four Arrows has a coaching, did a video for this series. And he actually, and it might be even sacrilegious to put him on this because this is a Western viewpoint that I'm presenting, and he presents an Indigenous viewpoint. But his way of coaching is to invite you into the Indigenous viewpoint. So in that sense, it's directive because or not directive, but it's framed because he's saying, come with me on this journey and talk to me about this consciousness that I hold in an Indigenous culture. And so it's a consciousness building practice because I then, if I want to work with Four Arrows, will follow him into this consciousness and together we explore it. And from what I saw, it seems like he's very reflective and very open and curious about what all of this means. And so it's a kind of a nice example about how you might be able to cross some of our cultural divides by using some of this consciousness building. And this is not to hit it over the head, you're doing stuff that's racist or whatever. It's saying, no, let's go explore the world together. When I first started coaching, we used a lot of style delineators. And those are things like, the styles of, we used actually auditory, kinesthetic, and visual. We used belief systems. We used different ones. And we used to do kind of a diagnostic thing. This person is missing something. And if we start to do diagnostic things, we're actually not living in the reflective zone. We're really pushing over to directive because our intentions shift and we're now directing their attention on a flaw that we've identified or a problem area with the coach. If I use those style delineators to build consciousness, in other words, the SCARF model, and I bring them into the coaching relationship, I can share them with somebody and teach them about it as a coach. But I'm not telling them, I'm asking them to reflect and make their own decisions. So it's really key to understand that you're not using this to diagnose. You're not letting it change your intention. Your intention is to co-ponder and to spend time together thinking about it. So this really is the four kind of ways that we looked at looking at what we call the reflective conversation. Are there any questions in the chat room? Should I keep going?
Yeah, keep going. It's great content. Okay. I can tell people are engaged.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. Whoops. So now we come to the top of our arc, and this one is really a fun one for me because this was an expertise of Bill's, and I had never really had a chance to use 360-degree feedback in my coaching. I had used it, knew about it and used it. And Bill had actually come up with a simpler way of doing it that I'll review in just a minute. But Bill's been able to work directly with Marshall Goldsmith and his organization. And he really uses 360-degree feedback. And what he does is he has, I think 360-degree usually has 10 to 12 people or 8 to 12 people fill out feedback anonymously or confidentially. And then the coach takes that feedback and presents it to the coachee. And the coachee then has to decide what they're going to do with it. And the reason that I call those, or we call those calibrating conversations, is that not everybody is open to this feedback. Some of them, in fact, are shocked. One of the coaching, I need to look at the name again. One of the coaching models that they had in this was Lynn Harrison talks about coaching the abusive boss. And one of the things she found in her research was the abusive boss actually didn't realize how abusive they were. They were often shocked at the 360-degree data. I think she used 360-degree or the data she collected that showed that they had a relationship problem with their employees. And and one of the reasons Bill in particular loved this model is Marshall Goldsmith doesn't take any money as a consultant. He calls himself a consultant, even though he's coaching. And until there is a calibration and there is the feedback comes in that the person is making changes as a result of the feedback. And I think that's important to understand because that really is a tipping point in this relationship. If the person takes the data and runs with it, they actually, if they're, let me give you 3 examples. The first person that's highly efficacious is going to say, oh my goodness, I thought I was a good listener, but I just realized I'm looking at this data that maybe I talk more than I should. The minute they say that, you don't need to do any more on the right side. You can move back into that other side and use all of the skills of mediation with them, because they're ready to think about their own problem and come to their own solutions. They're a gift. I used to tell people when they were learning to coach, go coach efficacious people, because they give you great goals for how you want them to think. And then don't take on your tough people till you've had a little practice. The people in the middle are going to say, I'm puzzled by this and I'm not sure that I really agree with it. I'm going to have to think about it. Or I might accept part of it, but I don't accept all of it. So I'll work on this part of it. And it's okay. All you need to do is have them give you a green light for any part of it, and you can begin to coach them using reflective conversations. It's when you have resistance, where the person doesn't believe that the data is true, or they blame the system, or they have some excuse about why there is no validity in the data, that you need to make some other choices. And so that's why when there was resistance and people didn't take that information, Marshall Goldsmith would return to the organization and he would say, this is a waste of money. This person is not going to grow as a result of this coaching relationship, and we need to terminate it, which would be way down there on the bottom, but it's a quick way to know whether they will do it. I want to say a couple of other things about this particular place too, because this is a place that's stuck a lot of people. And I want to make the distinction between this little asterisk. If you see, there's a little asterisk off here to the right. And that is a land that was one of the ahas we had, was that we realized when I was working as an educator, I started out way before we had standards-based education. And I really lived in the realm of reflective and let teachers tell me what they wanted to talk about. And then one day I was mandated to use standards. And one of my teachers, former teachers and a leader, is Terry Clark on this call. And I'd love to talk to her about this afterwards. But anyway, and what I found is when I started using standards, I wasn't living in this diagram anymore. I was living in an external world that was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. And if I had teachers that the standards that we were talking about were useful to them, we had the same kinds of conversations I'd always had. But not every teacher needed those kinds of conversations. Some of them needed a conversation about how to manage a kid or how to manage behavior. But because I was now mandated to use a knowledge base to form my coaching, I became much more directive and gave very few options. Another place I've seen this is I actually signed up myself to be coached by somebody a few years ago, and she used a coaching book. And it was fine in the beginning. It was very mediative and reflective because she asked me about my goals and things. But I found as we went through the program more, it became too directive. It was too linear in its sequence. And it's fine when you're first learning to coach. Yes, go through something all the way the first time, because that's how you learn. But real coaching that's elegant doesn't live in the world that's out there. It's based on real grounded theory. And that's what's so important about what Marshall, the 360 degree, brings to the coaching, is that it's based on real data. It's not some arbitrary thing that's been put out there that we think that we need to teach somebody. But what we found is an awful lot of what we began to be doing in teaching in some schools where there's failing kids, they talk a lot about fidelity, and all the coaching is to make sure the teachers are following a textbook. That's not the kind of coaching that I'm talking about here. It's what I call technical coaching. And technical coaching is very essential if you're trying to teach a skill. So if you're watching somebody coach and they're trying to learn how to do something or calibrate something, then yeah, you might give them feedback and you might make it more directive. But it's not the world that I want to live in as a full-time job. Where I want to live is I want people to become efficacious and self-reflective in their own right. So anyway, so we actually call that our 1 o'clock position. And we sometimes say, oops, we just slipped off and we're being much more directive than we think we should be. Then moving, I just want to look at the time really quickly. Yep, we're doing fine. So then moving along, we move, any questions?
Yeah, actually, there is one.
Okay.
Jennifer is curious, when someone is stuck and cannot seem to make the changes he or she knows are important, how do you nudge them?
Okay, Jennifer, it's the next place we're going. The data speaks for itself. I want to go back to this for a minute. Data speaks for itself. And what happens with people is I've often sent people away and said, you know, you're rejecting this data today, but this has come from 10 different people. And this is what they're saying about you, and it's consistent, because usually if there's a real flaw in the person, it shows up all the way through the data. It's not inconsistent. And you need to go home and look at this and come back to me and tell you how you plan to use this data to improve your performance. And anybody that really cares about their job will come back, unless they have what I call an emotional disturbance factor. There are some people that just for whatever reason just aren't willing to look at the data. And so I'm going to move to the right now, and it's going to show you some nudges. So it's a perfect question for where we're going. So as we move to this side, I mentioned that these things that we had over here were not things that people thought of as coaching things, but they are very, very important skills, particularly if you work with groups. But we've used the same skills in coaching. In my examples tonight, I'm going to give you a coaching example. But what we found is that in schools, if they're failing, it's not optional. If I'm working with a group of teachers that are in a school that has failing students, it's not optional for me to just kind of live over there in la la land of reflection and kind of act like everything is doing fine. I need to confront the issue, which is that we're in a failing school, or that we're in crisis, or burnout is another one that would live here. There's something that's burning us out in this school. And we turned to Jerry Sternum, who does something called positive deviance, where he actually studied cultures and found that there's always some in a culture that's successful, and that what you need to do is study those successes. And that also, those of you that have studied appreciative inquiry are going to understand that appreciative inquiry could live here. I actually read an article where appreciative inquiry was used very effectively to deal with, another one would be sexual harassment. You can't leave sexual harassment unattended to in an organization. And this would be a way to have a conversation about it. Let me give you an example of a conversation that I had with a teacher. I had it with a group of teachers, but I've also had it with individuals. A teacher or a group of teachers that are feeling a high degree of burnout. This would be appropriate for teachers now because this COVID crisis is really stressful. And one of the questions that you ask is, well, has there ever been a time when you've been successful? Or when you weren't burned out, what were you feeling? And through those kinds of questions and asking them to look to their internal resources, but around success, people find that there were times when they weren't burned out, and they actually remember things they did they aren't doing now. For example, in one of the conversations I had, the teachers realized that in their push to do standards, they had stopped doing art and music, and that those were the things that fed them the most in the classroom. I said, oh my God, in my head, how sad. And through the coaching, they gave themselves permission to bring their guitars back into the classroom, to take a break every Friday and do a big art project. They felt so compelled to get the test scores up that they had forgotten. The same thing with Jerry Sternum. He found that the mothers in Vietnam that fed their children little bits of shrimp actually had healthy children, and the ones that didn't have healthy children. So it's a really good example and a reminder that it is the resources are internal. But what's not optional here, and once you've set this up and given the data to the people and helped them think about it, you're actually moving back around up the arc, really to the left. Because once that teacher understood that part of their burnout was that they were pushing themselves too hard and not relaxing with the children and not engaging with them in the ways that had fed their soul so many times before, they now had the strategies they need to be self-reflective. But what was not optional was to continue to talk around the problem of burnout with that teacher. So I'm not sure if it's making it real clear, but let me go on to the next one and give you another example of a non-optional place. Conflict is another place that it's not optional to ignore it. Conflicts in organizations are real culture burners. They really can destroy culture as quicker than anything. And we use Bob Chadwick's model, conflict to consensus. Bob Chadwick was a longtime forest ranger and had worked with old growth forests in Oregon. So, and Bill actually worked with Bob personally for quite a few years before he passed away. And it's a very long process, and we don't usually recommend it to people, but Bill had found a way to simplify it. And it basically asks people to look at what are your worst possible outcomes, what are your most positive, what are the best possible outcomes, and then what do you really want to have happen? And when you get people to look at both sides of the coin, they often find common interests in what they're doing. And Bill has, in the book that we wrote, we have a lot of scenarios, and Bill tells how he worked with a football coach and a group of parents. And any of you that work in the high schools or have worked with sports know that conflicts between parents and coaches can be legion. and very effectively in a pretty short time got the group to be effective. And so it's another place where it's not okay to just ignore the conflict. And another example that I've had to use as a superintendent was that I had some employees that were in conflict with each other, and I had to tell them that it wasn't optional for them to keep behaving the way they were. They had to sit down with me, and that we had to go through a process of conflict resolution. And Bill, my friend, has just written a book with Solution Tree about conflict. And maybe at the end, Bill, you can just tell the name of it. I forgot it. I'm sorry. So, but those we called frame directions. We're giving a direction to our people, but it's about a process that we're going to use. It's not about how they're going to change their behavior. It's a process, really, but it's directive. It's not, it's very clearly, we have an outcome. We're going to reduce burnout. We're going to reduce failure. We're going to reduce the crisis. We're going to reduce the conflict. So it's much more directed. Then as we move around, we get to another form of data and feedback. And the one that we actually used in our book is very unlikely for most people that are in coaching, because we use something called FRISK. It's a really, really effective model for working with disciplinary action. And it was actually designed by legal consultants so that you document appropriately in case you have to tell the person to move on, which is where you see the next place is, or that it's not going to work out. But what I realized when I studied it was that it was really just a form of something that we call complete conversations actually comes from the psychology literature about giving a complete message. And so there's actually about 4 or 5 different variations on this. Frisk was just the one we chose to write about. And I watched Terry Hildebrandt, who was the person in Carrie's position until he took over recently. Congratulations, Carrie. And he did a very elegant coaching video with another person who was coaching, and he lived on the left-hand side. I didn't have this in front of me, so I didn't spend the time diagnosing exactly where he was, but he really went from reflective to framed and some consciousness moves. And with the coach, but the person he was coaching was also a coach, but in this case, he was the coachee. He was talking about a situation he had with a client where they weren't following through. And he was wondering whether he needed to terminate the relationship. And so when I saw that, I thought, oh, this complete conversation is exactly the kind of conversation that you need to have with somebody when it's time for them to maybe look at moving on. And the one I returned to is the original one I learned by MCKAY, Davis, and Fanning from 1993. So you can see it's very dated. But I will tell you, I have used this more than anything in my work as a leader because it helps people hear the data. It gives a big nudge. And what it is the complete message is that as a leader, I frame this message and I do the whole thing through to the person before I let them talk. So, and what you do is you don't want to get into a dialogue with them, you want to tell them. And so the first thing that you need to do is express your observations. And I'm going to give the example that coach could have used. They would actually state at the beginning of the conversation with the other person, we've met 4 times now, and each time you've agreed to do some things. The first time you agreed you were going to go home and write goals and bring them back. And when we came back, you said the dog ate your homework. I don't know what excuse they gave, but they gave an excuse. The next time you said that you were going to work on just getting 1 goal and 3 behaviors you wanted to do with that goal. And when you came back, you said that you had been sick. The third time, and you just go on, but you basically give really observable data. This is absolutely essential that this be clean, have no emotion to it, no thoughts, feelings. I often tell people, write this down before you go into the situation. The next 2 are really what we call I messages in communication theory. And it's your chance to give your beliefs and your feelings. So in the case of that coach, he could have said, I'm thinking that you're not getting what you need from this relationship, and that there's something that's blocking your behavior, and I'm confused about what it is. Or you could say, I'm feeling that the behavior that you're really not committed to this coaching relationship. So it's a chance for you to be honest and open with them. I've used this when people are doing something that affects other people, and that's where it's important to tell them how it affects their behavior. Like with that abrasive leaders, you need to say, well, when you behave in that way, here's how these people are responding to you. And that's the part where you would put that in. And then the last part is interesting. I found that when I've taught this to people, that people that aren't really clear about what they need don't always know how to state this. But what you need to be able to do is to say what you need that person to do. And this is where I like to hand the torch back to them and say, I need you to think about, like in this coaching example, I need you to think about whether this coaching relationship is really working for you. And if it's not working for you, what is it that you need to have happen to make it work for you? And it's okay if you think that maybe it's just not the right relationship and you think you would like to terminate it. That could be an option as well. And sometimes you talk about it then, and sometimes you leave it. But you always, at the end of this 4-step message, and I sometimes put thoughts and feelings together. I don't get too anal about having to do both, because really the observations and the needs paired with the middle work. And when I get to that point, then what I do is I say, okay, now it's your turn to talk. And again, just like Marshall Goldsmith listened, I listen for their acceptance. I've given them the cleanest data that I know how to give them. And if they can't take that data and do something to change their behavior so it helps the organization and their own professional practices, then I need to make a choice to do something different with them. And so that's why the exit plan becomes so important, and why it's important for us to know how to do that. So this is just one of these. I'm sure some of you already have some of these other ways of doing this, or you're going to say, oh, it's just like something else I learned somewhere else, maybe different names, but the process is the same. So I offer it tonight because I think it's a strategy that all of us can go out and use tomorrow, because it's a really good way to talk to people in an honest, open way that's congruent. Okay, we're at questions again. So I'm going to move off the dashboard. So if you have any questions for the dashboard, this is your chance to look at that or talk, ask.
Well, Diane, wow, this has been just so much amazing content. And I wrote this in the chat. I think your work is such a great example of using evidence-based theories and research from various schools of thought to really inform your work. And I think what I appreciate about your model, and I think coaches are often reluctant to do this, is to be that directive, to be that focused in giving hard feedback. I think, we'd much rather perhaps be in the co-pondering stage because that feels appreciative. And your model is almost a permission experience to say we are not serving our clients if they're over here on the right and we're still over on the left. So I really appreciate that. That's what I'm taking away. But I don't see any specific questions. I just see a lot of confirmation. Bill has added some resources. I put some links in there to different books that you've mentioned. Fernando was saying this is great information, very clear. Thank you. I welcome others, though, if you have questions or comments about this amazing material, this is your opportunity to take yourself off mute or to type it into chat.
I have 2 slides. If there's nobody off, I can't see all the screens. So
okay, why don't you go ahead and continue?
Okay,
Diane, this is wonderful.
Thank you. Oh, this is Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. She's somebody else I know.
Hey,
also
Diane. And I'm a mediator, and I wish everyone could hear this, because a lot of times mediators forget that a component of mediation is the creativity of cognitive coaching. And you really have said that so beautifully. I really, really appreciate it. And as you know, I really appreciate you. So thank you for including me on this. I'm loving the reminders.
Thank you. I have to laugh. One of the feedbacks we got when we turned the book into Corwin was somebody said, oh, cognitive coaching, that's an old model, isn't it? Well, they probably attended a training in the 80s, because that's when we started doing this work. So it's been around. It's proven. It's a proven model of coaching, particularly for those of you in education. But little advertisement there.
And I think seriously, as somebody who teaches around the country, I really think it needs recultivation, because a lot of people are not remembering that this is really valuable information and wonderful tools.
Yeah. Humble Inquiry with Edgar Schein too. I can't say enough about how powerful that is. So
yeah.
Anyway, shall I move on?
Yes.
Okay,
thank you, Diane.
Okay, so I'm going to finish with kind of a little bit of look at evidence-based because that's really what Fielding is pushing in their coaching model, which I really support and commend. And you can see it's kind of a model I've lived in my whole life without having, when I was at Fielding, by the way, there wasn't really much coaching support. It was kind of part of organizational development. And Jenny Edwards was there before me, who's on this call. And, you know, she and I used to do a lot with coaching, but other people didn't do so much. So anyway, I want to remind you that there's 3 ways for collecting evidence when you're doing this kind of coaching. The first one is ask your coach, the coachee, how did this work? What specifically worked for you? What should I do more of? What should I do less of? Get data for them and don't let them off the hook. This is another place where I've seen novice coaches kind of like, okay, it was just fine. Well, no. Is there anything that could have happened? Or if it really worked, what really worked well? One of the ways to build your efficacy as a coach is to find out what you're doing that makes a difference for your clients. So the other thing that we teach in cognitive coaching, and many of these other coaching models also teach, is to listen for language changes. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's an evidence of change in language in the coachee really helps you know if you're hitting what I call the pay dirt in your coaching. And then in cognitive coaching and in neurolinguistic programming and many other ways of working with people, they look at shifts in posture. The easiest way to describe this is when you're working with somebody and all of a sudden you see that they have an aha moment. When they have an aha moment, you see them go, oh, I just figured out something I hadn't thought about. Well, not everybody gets an aha moment, but they get small moments of clarity and you see them shift. They all of a sudden do something different. And you can teach people to watch for that. In cognitive coaching, we teach it as the cognitive shift, and we teach it explicitly, and we teach coaches how to look for it. So it's another example of evidence-based coaching. And I want to talk about the evidence of changes in thinking just briefly, because these are 5 constructs that have been very important to us in cognitive coaching. And they are examples of the change in language. And I'm going to go through them very quickly because we're almost at the end. Efficacy is what we've been talking about, but it means that the person goes from blaming to talking about internal resources. Instead of saying that I think that the kids are a problem, they start saying, here's what I'm going to do, and here's how I know I'm going to make a difference. Consciousness is where we help people to get a new insight by asking them to think more. Edgar Schein's work is all about consciousness raising. What are you going to do about it? How can you do it? We want everybody to have flexibility and multiple options. We don't want them to stay in stuck positions. And so we listen for language where they tell us that they now have ways to solve their problem. Craftsmanship is evidence of deeper understanding or a refinement. Oh, I just figured out that I hadn't been doing this. If I do this, it'll make me more capable. And the last one is no man is an island or no woman is an island. And we need to know that we're interdependent and we need to value other people and not think that being efficacious means that we just live in our own world and it's all about us. So with that, I'd like to just say in conclusion, coaches need to be efficacious by observing and listening for changes in their clients. We need to be conscious of our own knowledge and work to fill in gaps. And you see that I've been tenacious in my lifetime about that. We need to develop flexible pathways for solution finding. We need to promote action and develop craftsmanship through tenacious practice. We need to work with the coachee to develop an interdependence and a cultural efficacy. And if you're interested in cultural efficacy, I wrote a blog that Carrie can reference for us that was put out on the Fielding website about cultural efficacy. Short, easy for you to read. So very quickly, my books that if you want to know more, this is the book I wrote with Bill Sommers. This is the one that talks all about the dashboard, tells you all about the 9 conversations. Lemons to Lemonade, I wrote with my other mentor, Bob Garmston. And it actually uses locus of control as an argument. I'm going to slow down just a bit because I'm zooming all of a sudden. It uses locus of control to give you facilitation moves. It's about working with people in groups. Bob came to me with a list of all the behaviors that principals had given him that where teachers misbehave in meetings, which is legion in meetings, particularly in schools. And we basically sat down and sorted them, and we came up with solutions for working with people from least invasive to most invasive. So the most mediative to the least mediative. And so again, you'll see locus of control as an organizer there. And then the last 3 books that I mentioned are, I'm going to mention the one in the middle first. If you're interested in the 5 states of mind, the efficacy, consciousness, we did a really nice job of really going into depth with that. And I wrote that with my co-founders of Cognitive Coaching, Art Costa and Bob Garmston. I don't reference their books, but you can find them on the web. There also are textbooks out about cognitive coaching that they've written. I want to show this book really quickly. This book is my newest book, written with Bob Garmston again and another colleague, Jim Racine. But I want to just flash it for you if you can see it. It's got a lot of blue things in the margin. And all of the blue sections in this book are things that live on the right side of that diagram, ways to work with groups. And there's just, it's full of, chock full of all kinds of ways of intervening with groups. So if you're a person that's working with groups, it's a resource book. All of these books have maps and ways of thinking. And then finally, I want to pay tribute to Linda Lambert, who is another I've worked with, and some of you know, and she was one of the first people in 1993 to ask me to write a chapter for her first book on constructivist leadership. And this is another book that talks about leadership, but not so much about locus of control. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. And I found a COVID handshake that I can use. So anyway, if there's any questions, I'll answer them. Otherwise, thank you everyone for coming. So.
Yeah, this is fabulous. There is one question that I don't think you addressed. Anna's curious if you have any plans or perspectives on trauma-informed approaches, language or parts from internal family systems therapy.
I am going to be honest and say it's not an area I've studied in depth. I will tell you that people in crisis and burnout are trauma. They behave like trauma. If they're really in burnout, they act like they've been traumatized in some way. It's different, but they do. They lack resources. When somebody's in trauma, they lack resources. So working towards efficacy is positive. There was an Efficacy Institute that I don't remember the gentleman who started it. You might be able to Google it. That was with children, that was working with African-American children to build efficacy. And there was one other thought I had about it. Just went out of my brain. But no, I haven't worked particularly in that area. I don't feel comfortable giving you any advice there really, maybe at this point. So.
Can I answer that question just to?
Yeah, Jennifer would be perfect to do it. Go ahead.
Okay, I just started to write this in the chat, but there's a great book by Bruce Perry, who's a trauma specialist. He also has the neurosequential developmental model, and it directly applies to children's growth and development and what they experience and how their brain is changed by their experiences. And as teachers, I think you can absolutely benefit from this. The book is The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. It's a great book and easy to listen to if you're into listening to books audibly, and also a great read. I would do both if you really are interested in finding out how to create resilience in trauma.
And Jennifer, just so those of you that may not have calibrated it initially, is a psychotherapist, but she's spent her life mediating families in crisis and certainly has worked with many trauma-challenged children, and also does brain-compatible coaching for lawyers. So she knows a lot about all of this. Thanks, Jennifer. I can't see everybody on the call. Bill, do you have anything you want to say before we close out tonight, since you're my co-author? He may have signed off. He had someplace else to go. So
no, I didn't sign off. I just couldn't get the mute button off. No, but thank you. I really like to build repertoire, because we're going to need more repertoire and emotional agility to deal with more and more problems. So nice job, Diane. I really appreciate the kind words, but also you always make things so easy to understand.
Thanks. This is my first Zoom class, so thank you.
Well, Diane, I want to say just a warm thank you and just so much appreciation on behalf of Fielding for giving us this time. So much great content. I will be following up with everybody who signed up with Diane's handout that has the graphs, and then also I put a link in the chat for you to take a webinar survey through SurveyMonkey, so you can get your ICF-CEUs. You also have my email in there if you need any follow-up information or have questions. But again, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. What an amazing presentation. So much information to sort through. But
and Carrie, you're going to give out the information if they want to listen to any of the other symposiums that you've done?
Yes,
You'll send the
everybody
link?
has access on the website. So this will be a recording that's also added to the website. It's there on our public page. All the webinars are under the Comprehensive Certificate Program.
Great, great. So thank you, everyone. It's lovely to see some of my friends and some new friends. So this was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.